Hi there, BookTube. It's Ros, and it's the first weekend of July, so time for a wrap up about my June reading. And I read 15 books in June. I got to read some extras because I had a couple of weeks holiday, so it was a particularly lovely month for reading, and I'm going to share that with you. I have had less time in the last month or so to record kind of individual book reviews and so on. So got a lot to get through. I will use timestamps so that you can find the bits that interest you, but I'm going to put it all in one video. Okay. And the other thing that's going to make this video just slightly longer is because I've got a couple of kind of BookTube related but not book things to talk about before I start. And I really couldn't make a video about June without talking about the really terribly sad loss of Alice's giant bookshelf. See, I'm seizing up a bit trying to talk about it. One of the joys of BookTube, I guess, is that we make connections with readers around the world, don't we? And sometimes, we make a closer connection with some of those people. And I guess Alice was one of those people where, I felt like I was kind of on the way to becoming kind of more of a friend, beyond just watching each other's videos or, being involved in shared readathons or whatever. We actually, we met in person 3 times. She was a wonderfully warm, funny, quite sharp, it kind of in her analysis of things, but very, very generous spirited, and appreciative of other people's perspective. Just a really, a shining light person, and just taken much too young and much too soon and unexpectedly. And really, my heart goes out to Jim, her husband, and Jane, her mother, who's another enthusiastic reader that we've kind of various of us have encountered in our involvement with the plot along or whatever, and I can't imagine how they're feeling. And I also know that there are other booktubers out there whose connection with Alice was even stronger, and I'm sending all of you my love. Now that's a really sad thing that's sort of come from a BookTube friendship. If it hadn't been for that, I'd have started this video by talking about a really happy one that happened in June for me, which was that I got to meet up with Berna of Berna's Bookish Adventures. Now, I was on holiday in Turkey, and I knew that the place I was going to was not that far from where Berna lives. Berna's a Turkish booktuber, but she makes videos in English about all sorts of things. Agatha Christie is one of our points of connection, but many, and it was just such fun to spend a glorious day together, just nattering away about books. We also talked about Alice, as it happens, because she's another of Alice's BookTube friends. And we made a little video, which is on Berna's channel, and I'll link to that below. But yeah, that was a real, one of the delights of the month for me, without a doubt. But let's get on to the books. So, 15 books. I'm gonna, as I say, work through most of those in more or less detail. I'll start with the 3 non-fiction books that I read in the month. And the first of those was, or not the first to read, but the first I'm going to talk about is this one, Pyongyang by Guy Delisle. And so now, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll know that I've been learning to love and appreciate comics, and that I've particularly found that graphic memoirs are something that I often find very rewarding to read. This one is his new author for me. I've got another of his that I'm going to read in July. He's French Canadian, and this was translated by, now I had to write this, look where I've written it down because it's not stuck in my head. The translator was Helge Dascher. They don't make it so prominent. You have to hunt it out of a bit often, the translator of a comic, perhaps because, so much of the book is in the illustrations. So, perhaps, but the translation still matters, doesn't it? This is about 3 months that Delisle spent in Pyongyang, in the capital of North Korea, at a time when very few people were getting to go there, which is still the case, of course. But it was at the very beginning of the 21st century, the 2000s, when the North Korea was sort of opening up some kind of commercial connections. And specifically, one of the things was that sort of European and American too, I think, animation companies, film companies making cartoons and so on, would get some of the technical work, the drawing, done in North Korea because it was cheaper. So, but they'd send sort of one of their regulars over for a period of time to kind of quality control and steer the work. And so Delisle got to do that. And this is his description of what it was like being a sort of a foreigner in Pyongyang at that time. His graphic style, the kind of black, white, grayscale kind of quality, really works for the subject matter. It's a book that's kind of quite funny, but also, really, because it picks up the absurd in sort of North Korean society, and how kind of sort of deluded, I suppose, people seem to someone coming from the West, because they're so cut off. They're just, what are they supposed to believe? Because when they've got nowhere else to find things out from. But also, it's tense, it's dark. There's a feeling of sort of unspoken threat around, I suppose. Really cute observation as well. I enjoyed that one. One I'd recommend. Now, next one I'm going to talk about is Give Birth Like a Feminist. Hey, Ros, you say, why are you reading a book that's basically a sort of birth manual come sort of socio-political thing on birth? The reason is because Tilly of Tilly Shelf is my daughter, and she's, as you probably may have noticed, expecting a baby this autumn. So I was reading this to, get up to speed, because it's a long time since I had my babies, So it's by Milli Hill. Now, really interesting, useful, informative. There is one thing, though, that was a kind of threw a bit of a pall over the book, and that was that, unfortunately, Milli Hill, actually rather stupidly, I think, sort of got herself caught up in the radical feminist trans debate, and it effectively ended up sort of sounding quite transphobic in places. So that was a bit of a barrier for me. But there's a lot of really good stuff in the book. So I sort of gritted my teeth and read it, even though I knew that was going to come up at the end of the book. But not one I'd recommend unless you happen to be, involved with a pregnancy. Now, the third non-fiction book I read was much easier to love, and that was recommended by commenter extraordinaire Stephanie Cohen, and she heard me talking about reading Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which I finished in May, and she suggested, have you read The Wife of Bath, a biography by Marion Turner that came out in 2023? No, I said, I haven't, I've forgotten it came out. When she said it, I thought, oh yes, I did see that somewhere, but it hadn't really lodged in my brain. And very glad that I read it. It is, yes, it's a biography of a fictional character. Not exactly, but sort of. There's kind of two halves to the book, and in the first half, Turner really looks at Chaucer's character, the wife of Bath, how he took quite misogynist source material and made her this sort of wonderful, feisty, rich character that is comes to life and for readers, and continues to influence things to this day. She gives all the kind of social and historical context of the period, and why what he was doing was quite groundbreaking in the way he was writing the character, but that aspects of her life were not without precedent in the sort of historical record. The second half of the book is about how writers and artists and so on have been inspired by the figure of the wife of Bath ever since, like from Shakespeare, up to the present day, and really contemporary poets, including, poets from more marginalised groups, latching on, women latching onto the wife of Bath as an inspiration. So great fun. I listened to her reading the audiobook. I would say you can sort of tell that she's an academic, and this has sort of grown out of her academic interest in Chaucer, but she brings to it real verve and enthusiasm. So, but one to read if you've read The Wife of Bath's Tale from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, because otherwise, I'm not sure it would make sense otherwise, but perfect companion to reading that. So let's swap to fiction. And I expect some of you, this is where you'll have come back in, having looked at the timestamps and thought, this is the section that interests me more. So I read, where are we? 12 works of fiction. And I'm going to go through them. Well, I'm going to start by mentioning two that I can't talk about at all. And then I'll go through them in vaguely a sort of ascending order, but not quite as literally as that. So the two I can't talk about at all are the two that I read in June for the BookTube Prize quarterfinals, one of which was Tom Lake by Anne Patchett, and the other was, which I kind of knew and was expecting to read at some point this year, the other was Lone Women by Victor Laval, which would have passed me by completely if it wasn't for the BookTube Prize. But I will say no more about either of those till I get to the results of the quarterfinals are announced. I will do a video then, of course. You can rely on that. So that leaves me with 10 to do in sort of, as I say, vaguely ascending order. And I'll end with my absolute top 3 favourite reads of the month, which were all kind of fiction. Although the last one was kind of like almost uncategorizable, but I'll come to that. You're digressing, Ros. So, bottom of the pile, but still a jolly good book, because this was a good reading month, and like a solid 4-star book, shall we say, was Hungry Ghosts by Kevin Jared Hossein. That's it. I was saying, is it Jared or Javid? Jared. Came out in 2023. It was my choice for CaribAthon. Hossein is Trinidadian author. It won the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction in 2024, so just really recently. It's set in the 1940s in Trinidad, and kind of in a rural area, centred around, a small community, like 2 or 3 families in particular. I suppose what is really particularly interesting about it as a book, as historical fiction, is that it's taking something that perhaps, if you're not from the Caribbean, it is perhaps sort of slightly unfamiliar subject, which is the sort of aftermath of the indentured labour system they had there. So after slavery was ended, there were sort of labour shortages, and one of the solutions was, almost the equivalent of slavery, really, enslavement. It was bringing indentured labourers from the Indian subcontinent, to work on plantations and so on, and in very poor conditions. And that kind of went on from about around 1835, something like that, through to 1917. So, a long time. And then, when this book is set in the 1940s, the descendants of those indentured labourers are still living in extreme poverty and, facing a lot of discrimination, including discrimination, religious discrimination, because if they're Hindu, if they haven't converted to Christianity. So great premise to go to that. And this is a book that really gives you a really good sense of place, a sense of atmosphere. The central characters are dealing with grinding poverty and doing what they, the different ways to kind of get by. There's a certain amount of violence. There's a lot of love. So. And a sort of slightly kind of semi-thrillerish sort of quality to it in places. Why was it, when I've said all that, why was it sort of only a solid 4-star and not more? Because for me, it kind of sprawled a bit, lots of characters, lots of plot. And towards the latter part of the book, it was like, oh, you've got too many threads here that you're trying to tie up, but that's sort of, the negative thing about a good book. It's not, it's still a do read, I would say. Now, I read 2 more books by Elizabeth Bowen this month as part of our sort of Elizabeth Bowen deep dive that I'm involved in, and I think I absolutely love Bowen's writing, but I think because I'm reading so many of them, I'm kind of getting a little picky now, So one of them I would say is again sort of solid 4-star book, but kind of again like at the bottom end of my favorite, overall sort of ranking for the month, and that was her last book, Eva Trout, which was published in 1968. So I think I probably best love her books that she wrote in the 20s and 30s. And why did I not love this one so much? It just was, it wasn't quite as tight for me as sort of all the earlier ones that I'd read, and got a bit melodramatic in places, whereas what I love about her is the sort of the detailed observation, the descriptions, the dialogue. So still a really good book, and if I hadn't been read a whole load before it, maybe I'd be rating it more highly. The one that I read immediately before that was A World of Love, more or less a novella. This one was also sort of post-war, came out in 1955, and this I found kind of slightly funny, uneasy, everything that I love best about Bowen, set in a sort of tight location, lots of description, lots of people's interrelationships that are with lots of unspoken going on. Yeah, definitely. I'd go for this one in preference to Eva Trout if you were fancying a go at one of the Bowens that I've read. So, a similarly kind of short and tight book that, but much more up to date, that I read and loved this month, and that was sort of one step up, I think, from those two, was, and Hungry Ghost, was Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. Now, I haven't got a copy to wave because I had it from the library and had to go back. It's a book from 2023. It kind of got quite a lot of attention. I was really pleased to finally get around to it. It starts with a sort of very melodramatic incident, in contrast with this one that ends with a very melodramatic incident, and then does kind of confounds your expectations, I suppose. The melodramatic instance is, and this is not a spoiler because it's right at the start, the death of a small child on a London housing estate. But what it becomes is a book about a family, and a family that is kind of falling apart, and why, and it is, as the title says, it's about ordinary human failings. Why is it not even higher up my my sort of list for the month? I would quite have liked to have a bit more about one of the characters. One of the characters, there's the family, but then there's a sort of tabloid journalist who puts the family in a hotel and is trying to get his big break by getting a story out of them, and is hoping it's going to be sort of lurid, a lurid tale. And actually, his character was quite interesting, and I'd quite liked it almost to be longer and have a bit of backstory about him. It's not like me to say I wouldn't have minded that book being a bit longer, is it? But a wholehearted thumbs up for it as a book, though. Yeah, really, really well put together, I thought. And I actually, found it really, truly sad in places. Now, you will have heard me talk about reading last month, Brotherless Nights, set in the Sri Lankan Civil War. And in the video that I made about that with Tilly, I mentioned that I also read another book, but in June, set during the Sri Lankan Civil War, and that's this one, The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida. And I won't say a lot about it because I kind of mentioned it in that video with Tilly. But whereas Brotherless Night kind of addresses writing about the awfulness of civil war by a kind of very realist kind of approach, this, in this, Shehan Karunarilaka takes almost the opposite approach, and yet it's equally effective, because what he does is goes for something that is kind of almost like a kind of satirical fantasy ghost story, and yet with very, very realist kind of bits thrown in. So, this photographer wakes up dead and has the chance to sort of revisit his life, the world that he lived in, as a ghost, in effect, and try and work out how he died, why he died, who killed him, but also to try and preserve his archive of photos that are kind of like a witness to some of what happened during the Sri Lankan Civil War. So, yeah, very, very interesting book. I can absolutely see why it won the BookTube Prize in 2022. But onward. Now, another book that's a bit weird, and sort of fluctuates between sort of an intense feeling of reality and kind of going off on something a bit sort of fantastic and almost psychedelic, is You Dreamed of Empires by Alvaro Enrigues, and translated by Natasha Wimmer. And Enrique is a Mexican writer, and it's a book about the conquest of Mexico by the Spanish, but not in a kind of literal kind of way. But I will say no more, because Tilly and I are going to make it was Tilly and my recent fiction choice for June. We'll make a video about it. I'm excited to tell you that I loved the book and Tilly really didn't. So, that's gonna bring perhaps a slightly more controversial sort of discussion between us to that video. So I'm going to save my thoughts for that. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum of sort of literary style, from something like Seven Moons or You Dreamed of Empires, was one of the other kind of backlist or classic book that I read this month, and that was Henry James, A Portrait of a Lady. Now, the thing about James is he's writing, it's a kind of highly polished, highly detailed, yes, realist, but in a sort of very stylized style. I'm not explaining that very well, am I? I'll carry on. I'll carry on and see if it becomes clearer. So this was published in, when did he publish it? 1881, but then he revised it a bit for the 1908 edition. And it's set in a kind of an easy world of comfort and leisure. Rich English people living in England and Italy and France, and well-off Americans coming over and living or visiting. So, a world of comfort in physical terms. But what he is setting out to do is to delve into the sort of human consciousness, human pain, human motivation within that world. Because, just because human beings are physically comfortable doesn't mean that their lives necessarily go right. And his main, it's a portrait of one woman and the impact of coming into wealth on her and how she makes decisions and the decisions that she makes. It's you get this very detailed descriptions. I love the structure of the book because you get sort of periods that you get in enormous detail, and then you'll get a sudden gap, and months or years pass, and then he'll sort of drop you in to a new point, and you have to kind of catch up with what's happened, and then he'll maybe do a bit of sort of looking back to fill you in. But I like that. I like that a lot. It's a bit long, a bit kind of, like if you were writing it today, you'd kind of speed everything up a bit probably. But that's not a criticism. It's just, styles have changed, tastes have changed. But I'm very, very pleased to have read it. And yeah, I'm sure it's the first kind of one of his major novels that I've read, and I expect I will read another at some point. Now, this takes me on to, when time's getting on, my 3 favourite books of a great reading month. Now, I don't want to try and rank them. I'll just say they're my 3 favourites. So what shall I talk about in a minute? Well, I'm going to start with the other Mexican book that I happened to read this month. And this is Stillborn by Guadalupe Nettel. Not sure how you pronounce it. Anyway, Fitzcarraldo magic stuff. It was written in Spanish and published in 2020, but the translation was published 2022. It's by Rosalind Harvey, really good translator. Now, this is a quiet book, okay? And, you could embark on it and think, it's kind of just quiet, subtle, maybe nothing special, I don't know, It's quite introspective. It's about motherhood and choosing non-motherhood and forming attachments and kind of acceptance, love and loss. And so I said it was a quiet book, but as you read it, it is so engrossing. For a book with very little plot, it was a really propulsive read for me. Somehow it's just gripping emotionally. It's gripping emotionally despite being written in this very sort of kind of cool, lucid sort of style. Immaculate translation. So, all I can say is don't be put off by the odd sounding title, and read it, please. Yeah, it's great. Equally wonderful book in translation is this one, Forbidden Notebook by Alba de Céspedes, originally written in Italian and quite a while ago, but only recently translated. So I think it was published in Italy in 1952, and then this translation published was 2023. So, and the translation is by Anne Goldstein, such a good translator. Now, there's a bit of a thing going on at the moment, I think, of people rediscovering certain kind of backlist authors from other whose work was well thought of in the country where it was written, whether that's France, Germany, Italy, but didn't get translated or didn't get kind of like widely read in the English-speaking world. And a good example would be Natalia Ginsberg. I had a moment of blankness about her surname, and a whole sort of raft of her books are coming out at the moment, and they are great. And she's Italian. And here's another, really well known at the time. I know Sartre knew and admired her. Really interesting woman life, which I won't go into, but unknown sort of really to most English-speaking readers. And really great this translated, and I think there will be more to come. It's called Forbidden Notebook because it's set probably around 1949, 1950 in Rome, and the main character buys herself a notebook and starts to keep a kind of secret personal journal, and that journal is the book, so it's first person in a sort of like a diary sort of format. Hence we get very much her inner life, her innermost feelings, but also, of course, even when we're writing a diary, are we always absolutely honest about our innermost feelings? She's a kind of an unreliable narrator too, and we sometimes, we probably see her even more clearly than she sees herself. But that process of recording things in her journal, in her notebook, kind of makes her start to notice and question the way that she as a person has kind of disappeared into marriage. And, not that her husband doesn't love her, not that it's necessarily an unhappy marriage, and she, and her life with children and her job that I think she quite enjoys, but that somehow nevertheless she's lost herself. Reading it, you just really become, she becomes, it's one of those books where the main character becomes a real person to you. It feels like, I feel like, I know her and I spent time with her. It's a book that I could honestly recommend to, any reader. It's not, there's nothing, it's not challenging, but it's accessible, and yet it's deep. There you go. So we're down to my very last book that I'm going to talk about, and it's this one. And I'm going to be right up front and say this is not a book that I would recommend to everyone, but if you're the right kind of, it's one of those ones that I've read where I think if you're the right kind of reader, you might love it as much as I did. So it's After Sappho by Selby Wynne Schwartz. It came out in 2022, and I was really interested at the time, but just didn't get around to reading it. I'm so happy that I did. How on earth to describe it? Well, it's marketed as a novel, but the characters in it are real. So whereas this one, you feel like you're reading a real person, but actually, they're definitely fictional. This one, you're reading about real people, but you're not sure how much of what's being said is actual sort of fact and how much is sort of supposition or fiction. It has loads of characters. How to explain? It's like little bits of the lives of a whole series of fascinating queer women from the early 20th century, groundbreaking women who were writers and artists and thinkers, people that made connections between, and the book makes it's almost like a kind of slightly fictionalized group biography but in little bits, because after Sappho, obviously, sort of references the poet Sappho and queer writing, but it's also after Sappho in the sense of it's in fragments, and Sappho's poetry we only have in fragments, so it kind of, its style reflects that. It's so, I know some people that have read it. I've seen reviews on sort of Goodreads or Storygraph or whatever that say, oh, this is like a kind of whole load of little bits snipped out of Wikipedia and stuck together in a, random order. It's not. I couldn't agree less. But, if you can't bear kind of something that jumps around, that is multiple, has sort of, multiple characters, that has virtually zero plot, don't read it. But if you're up for hearing about, hearing things about people that like Virginia Woolf or Sarah Bernhardt or Colette, hearing about people that you ought to know about but maybe don't, like Lena Paletti or Eileen Gray, so many interesting people in this book, and something about the style of the writing. How could you say it's like clips from Wikipedia? It's more like kind of a prose poem, I suppose. Really, quite lyrical, and quite emotional at times. I loved it, as you can tell. So there we go. But you will probably know from that whether you'd want to read it or not. So thank you if you stuck with this to the end. It's an exceptionally long one for me. I always love to hear if you have read any of these books and your views of them, whether they're positive or negative. So, do put that in the comments, or, if I've inspired you to pick one up, it's always nice to hear that too.